Hi, welcome to BlackFest. My name's Susie Gallagher and I'm one of the directors. Today we're going to be in discussion with some amazing artists and also with TATE Liverpool. We have Louise Shannon, who is the head of programming at TATE Liverpool. We have Ekua Bayonu, who is a sculptor, artist, multidisciplinary. And we also have textile artist Selena Day and Olo Uduku, who is a professor of architecture and head of architecture at Manchester School of Architecture. So with further ado, I shall introduce Louise. As I said, Louise is head of program at TATE Liverpool, program delivery at TATE Liverpool. And she joined our organisation in 2020 in a new role which oversees the gallery's exhibitions, education and event programmes. Previously, she was a curator and the acting head of contemporary programmes at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where she was responsible for exhibitions, commissions and events, programme including and Friday Late. Throughout her career in institutions and as a freelance curator, Louise has sought to bring audiences closer to leading and emerging artists through exhibitions, live performance, film, installation, music, and debate. So welcome, Louise.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much. And hello to all the other panelists. It's a real pleasure to see you all today. Again, just to extend the thank you to BlackFest for some really interesting discussions over the last few months. I think we started talking in June about what an event could be, and I have really personally enjoyed those discussions with you, Susie, so thank you to you in particular. So it's obviously an incredibly important moment, and TATE, like all cultural organisations, is reflecting on its work around diversity and inclusion, especially in the rapidly shifting economic and social landscape which we've found ourselves in 2020. Just to give a bit of context, so TATE is made up, it has one national collection and 4 gallery sites, so that's 2 in London, so you have TATE Modern and TATE Britain, 1 in St Ives in Cornwall, and 1 here in Liverpool, which opened in 1988, which was part of the regeneration of Liverpool during that time. So today, really, I'm here to discuss these issues and to speak from a perspective of TATE Liverpool and some of the action that's been taken to enforce TATE's overall response to anti-racism that was set out in the TATE-wide response in response to the murder of George Floyd and the increasing urgency to respond to Black Lives Matter. I think it's important to say that our role at TATE is to share art in all its complexity and diversity, and in recent years there has been some progress in representing Black artists and artists of colour in our collection and programme, but just to state that we absolutely have to do better in that area and that we are doing lots of work to address that. We know that not everyone has equal access to art and its benefits, and we're working really hard here to think about how to challenge ourselves and to dismantle those structures within our own organisation that can perpetuate that inequality. But just to say that we recognise that that work has not gone far enough, but we hope that with we have a new director in place in TATE Liverpool who started in 2018, Helen Legg, who has a real commitment to changing the organisation here through both audience, our programme, our workforce. So hopefully we'll be working towards some really significant change. So I just wanted to foreground that, as we are in a very interesting time at the moment, and I think it's important to state that. But to Susie, so, and we'll have lots of questions that will come up, I'm sure, about TATE and some of the work that we're doing, but this is also to talk about art and practice. So Susie, I would like to hand over to you and to ask you some questions about your practice and where your kind of grassroots art practice has started and the areas that you're interested in.
Well, before I do that, can I just thank our viewers for actually buying tickets and joining us today, because without you, our message won't travel. Right, I'm notoriously bad at talking about myself, but my interest in art started, I think, really when I was little. We lived down south and Mum used to take us on mystery tours. What I soon learned was that these mystery tours were when she was taking us out somewhere and had got lost. So we did sort of stately homes, because we lived in Buckinghamshire. We did stately homes, but it would be a mystery tour. We didn't know we were going there, but that's where we ended up. And yeah, so going to these grand houses was something that we did as a treat on the mystery tour. But my particular interest is in textiles. As you can see, I'm wearing a wax print, and over my shoulder is a painting of me at the age of about 3 wearing Yoruba, a Yoruba outfit. All my life I can remember being given fabrics by family members, my grandparents when they visited from Ghana, and family friends and relatives. And it's something I've always grown up with. As a young adult, I studied art history at Leicester Polytechnic and had a fabulous time. But after I graduated, I suddenly realised that I hadn't really looked at I couldn't remember looking at any non-Western art in particular. So I took myself on a course on Indian art, and then volunteered at Leicester New Walk Museum. From there, I got my curatorial training, and the first was working on the Gujarati collection, literally unpacking it and going down to London to the fumigation centre and having to open these crates that had been sat in India for years and pop all the plastic bags before they could be fumigated. So, you know, I've done sort of the glamorous side and also the not so glamorous side of work. The textiles really inspired me because they're not just fabrics, they are stories as well. They contain a woman's history, and that's, I think, is what fascinated me. At the time of African Caribbean Focus, I was at the museum, and they were looking for the arguments discussions that we're having today about what objects mean and where they come from, were still being had at that time. And I said, well, I've got some fabrics, African fabrics. And what I really meant is that in my student digs, I had my summer my outfits, which had a bit of kente, a bit of tie-dye, a bit of strip woven fabric, choker fabric from Nigeria, and some natural dyed fabrics. And that's how I started with Afrograph, going around giving talks about fabrics and exhibiting and running workshops. So the other thing about Afrograph is that we have a huge collection of African textiles which I've inherited or have been handed down, the women's line of the family. So the oldest pieces are not technically African, like the Queen Victoria Diamond Jubilee cloth, which would have been made in Manchester, but it was made for the Diamond Jubilee, sent over to West Africa, and my great-great-grandmother had bought a piece of it and made it into a wrapper. So, you know, there's all sorts of links and toing and froings, but that's how I started with my textiles. Right, and that's actually quite a nice part to sort of hand over to Selena, Selena Laverne, who is a textile artist. But I think, Selena, what's really exciting about your work is that your practice. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so that was a good segue there, Susie. I'm a textile artist, I'm a zine maker and a workshop facilitator. But my textile practice is quite different. I think I use a lot of felt is like my main use of fabrics that I use. I think it's like cheap, accessible, bright colours, and I do a lot of kind of traditional kind of needlework, so embroidery, cross stitch, things like that. It's all kind of inspired by like kind of 90s pop culture and like kind of commentary on that, being like a woman, a queer woman of colour who's also working class. I think that feeds a lot into my work, so that's kind of very representative. So it's quite fun and quite bright, and you know, I think that's kind of how I am at first glance, but then when you take a closer look you can read other messages inside it. But yeah, so it's kind of like, yeah, very basic kind of embroidery skills. I do a lot of freestyling sewing, so nothing super technical, but yeah, textiles is where my heart is.
And I think, like you, colour was one of the things that I loved about the African designs. There's colour was an important part, and also there is embroidery. So can you sort of talk about how class, because I think that's really important, how class has sort of influenced the activism in your practice?
I think like I was saying, like I've realised, I slowly realised the more I make more art is that it's literally just about me. But I always say that I create art in a way to kind of take up space, and then other people that are similar to me, whether they are like a black woman or a queer woman or a working class person, that they see it and see someone else like them creating art and that they can also take up that space. And I think class plays into a lot of everything that I do, especially in like the zines I make. But I think within art, as I've gotten older, I've slowly realised that often art and the art world is not made for people like me. It's not made for working class people. And as soon as you it's seen as this thing that's not for working class people as well. So like art in itself is something that middle class people enjoy and get to take part in. And it's this thing, it's like, why, if you are of a different socio-economic class, you can't enjoy art? Even like the way art is taught in schools. There was a time a few years ago with my friend who did study art. I've got zero like formal art training. The last time I did any kind of art was 20 years ago when I was in school. And, you know, we'd be at like openings and stuff that she has exhibiting at, and people would be saying things like, oh, so where do you do your art? And I was like, in my bedroom. And they'd be like, where do you study? It's like, yeah, my bedroom. And they'd be like, what do you, and I'm like, oh no, I'm not from anywhere, you know, like making sure that a certain name attached to a certain school would then, they'd instantly be like, oh, so that's, you know, how worthy is your practice. And I kind of want art to be super accessible and let you know that it's literally a thing that everybody can enjoy and everybody can partake in. And I think class plays a major part in that, because, you know, a lot of people go into white wall galleries and you instantly feel, I'm not welcome here, this isn't for me. And I don't think the art world should be like that. It shouldn't be for a certain type of person. It shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable. So I think even if I'm not creating art in that sense, I'm often speaking about the fact that why can't people like me create art or exhibit or be in places like that?
That's really important, because literally until about a year ago, I didn't call myself an artist for some of the reasons that you're talking about. Things that it's that sort of public and private space that we inhabit, and if we don't value it, nobody else is going to value it.
Yeah, I've got like an inner turmoil dialogue with myself where I'll be like, I'm going to call myself an artist, but then part of me is like, you know, the people on the estate down there be like, you're an artist, oh, you think you're something? And it's like, why should I think that? And so I often introduce myself like, I'm an artist and a retail worker, you know, I'm like, I've got another job, you know.
Proper job, yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I've got a proper job, and I'm like, but art is a proper job. It's that balance of, I don't want people to think I've better than them because I'm an artist, but then who invented that term? Like, who decided that being an artist makes you, that's because it isn't for the working class. So yeah, it is a thing. Like you said, I find it, I'm like, yeah, I'm an artist. I also work in a shop, but yeah, it's this weird, like, kind of feeling.
I think if I can jump in a little bit, I think it's also the role of institutions to remind themselves of exactly that and what it feels like for someone to first cross a threshold into a gallery. So I am, part of my practice has been very audience focused. So I like to remind people when we are developing events or exhibitions not to make assumptions about people who want to come across, like literally what is the barrier to entry to a gallery, and that might not just be ticket price. It's thinking about how comfortable you might be in the main entrance or what the welcome is for people. So it's something I totally see it happening in museums and galleries, and we absolutely have a role to think about class much more than we do, especially here in Liverpool, and to think about what that local audience is. It's really important.
Yeah, one of the questions I wanted to ask Selena is about your work with the collective Yikes.
Yeah, you like 3 eyes.
Yeah.
That was the first 3 of us. We thought that'd be funny. Yes, we haven't done anything for probably about 4 or 5 years. I think one of our members has had 2 children in that time. So, you know, and then we've had like been busy with lives, but I think we do want to revisit it. But our main purpose of Yikes was, it was kind of like to create like a fun environment. So for context, there's me, who's like a textile artist, my friend who is she teaches knitted textiles as a lecturer, but knits on the side as well, and my other friend who's a fine art painter. So we wanted to kind of make art fun, because we're very much like, you know, we like the meaning, but sometimes you just want to go and look at something and just be like, I like that. And at the time when we formed, probably like 7 years ago, we were like, the world is such a depressing place, you know, it's not got better, it's got worse. So we wanted some, you know, to bring joy to like gallery walls, and our aim was to kind of like have interactive art that would be accessible for people, and to, you know, be able to go into kind of like white wall galleries and create things. We did a lot of kind of like UV glow, slime, kind of just like really silly stuff that we, you know, so anyone, any age, anyone, any class can come in and just take some kind of enjoyment from it, and realize that art doesn't have to be serious. And it's not that thing where you go and you're like, but did you really get the meaning behind it? I mean, we had an exhibition called The Glowing World of Snot Boobs and the Severed Toe. So, you know, there's not really much. It's literally like a bra that was like drippy slime.
Imagine the exhibition poster now, it sounds amazing.
You know, like we just wanted to be like, you don't have to be educated in a certain way to understand art or get enjoyment from it. We just want people to take 10 minutes out, see something, and then like brighten their day. And that was kind of our main aim. We also formed a band where we couldn't really play, but we had matching outfits. We were like Destiny's Child, bad instruments and like matching slime outfits. Yeah, it was taking that thing, you know, like going where like an art collective is kind of like pretentious and serious and spinning it on its head and being like, we're a bunch of women, you know, 2 of us are working class, 2 of us are people of colour, you know, we're just here again taking up space, creating some stuff and making it fun.
Yeah. I don't know whether Ola or Akura want to ask any questions of you, Selena.
Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting what you do. I mean, in some ways, I think the question goes across to both Selena and Louise. I mean, part of it isn't part of it also taking art to the people. So, because I was taken by actually Louise's point that people find the gallery in some ways a barrier. And it's that thing about, can we occupy spaces where people can engage with art without it being not for the likes of us? So I don't know whether you do, I guess, more audience engagement. I don't like the word community, because I think it is also laden.
Yeah.
Where I think particularly for kids and everything, that idea about sort of taking it to the schools and so on.
Yeah, I think one of my the big drives in my career is trying to meet people on their own terms and not making those assumptions about whether people know what a gallery is, whether that's the V&A or TATE, or in some of the freelance projects I worked in the Northwest on, I think it's about making sure that absolutely we meet people on their own terms. So we've had a project that's on display at the moment is called Ideas Depot, in which it's a funded project with our learning and exhibitions team, in which we are having our local schools curate the collection. So we have some of the collection here, and that's available for them to curate and to hang and to make sense of on their own terms and how they see it. But I think there's absolutely room to do more. We are currently reevaluating a lot of our events program, changing how we, what type of events that we do, whether that's a kind of late night event, who that's curated by, really importantly, and who the program speaks to. We have a new program called Tackling the Blues, which is going to be working with Everton and the community, which is helping to support mental health challenges that young people have in the moment. So we will be going out into schools, absolutely, to support that work. But galleries and institutions can always do more outside of their walls. It's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested actually, Selena, in terms of, because we're in this environment, what would you as an individualized or your collective be wanting of those formal spaces? Because I'm going to be talking about an intervention that I did with a group of women within Manchester Art Gallery. Actually, we offered to the TATE and they said no. But I think the starting point for me is, what would you want? What do we want in terms of as artists from those spaces?
Yeah, I think because when we were with Yikes, we were trying really hard for our, we had a couple of exhibitions that we kind of organised ourselves, and we were trying really hard, to kind of infiltrate and get in spaces, and we found it quite difficult. And some people are oh, it doesn't quite fit, and it's well, that's the point. Maybe it needs to fit. And I think what we want is just being able to take up these spaces, so then other people like us can then come in, feel comfortable, but not just a one-off thing. We did that now, we've done the community engagement, we've managed to bring some people. It's but can you sustain them coming in? Well, I've been to certain, I'll go to an exhibition or some places, but I'll go just for that one thing because I know I like it. But then if I didn't feel comfortable there, I'm not going to return. It's being able to it's opening it up and not opening it up for one certain small thing. It's keeping that longevity and making sure that engagement is there continually. I think that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, because I wonder within doing that how we as artists can do that in an equitable way, because how can we engage in shaping how those spaces curate with the imbalance of things like funding? If you're sitting in a room with a person who's paid to do that job and you're coming in and wanting to say you want to shape that, you want to have that as a long-term relationship, but you're actually, or you start on an uneven playing field.
Yeah, it's the weird one, isn't it? Because it's I think I took a while to call myself an artist, and the first few kind of 5 years I was getting used to it, and then in the past couple of years, because I do a lot of workshops as well, and I've gone into big institutions and art places, and I find the engagement there is, and I hate doing them, and I leave and I feel a bit oh, I didn't like it. But then I've done more kind of community-based ones, groups with young people, young working class people, migrant women, and they're my favorite ones. It's engaging people with art practice that aren't necessarily engaged in the mainstream with art practice. And I think I kind of shied away and was right, I don't mind calling myself a community artist, because that's what I'd rather be. But then it's kind of separating that, and then knowing, you're saying, I feel like I'm on an uneven playing field. So I've just gone, well, I'll just take it elsewhere. So I don't know how we can.
I think the work that you do is sort of, there's a need for the work as in the community level, but I think as artists we are the bridge, we are the change makers for the institutions, and in a way that's the role, that's one of the roles of being an artist. And with that I shall move on to Akua Beonu. And I'm actually going to let you
introduce myself.
talk a little bit.
Before I do that, just my other comment really to Selena, which I think is a really, really vital offer as artists to all communities, but is that whole statement about fun, about having fun and joy.
Yeah.
And I think particularly as Black women, leading in the way and saying to our communities, it's good to have fun and joy.
Yes.
And be joyful, that joy is a political act from my perspective. So yeah, I was really enthusiastic about that approach to your art making. Oh, you want me to introduce myself? So I'm not going to give a lot of background. I'm going to make our audience work a little hard. I've got a very unique name, Akua Bayunu. Google me away. I introduce myself, I suppose, at the moment as a artist, politician, grandmother. Without any, they segue into one being artist, politician, grandmother, and that's how I'm trying to live my life, and my life is my practice, and my practice is my life. I think the easiest way to start is going to be with sharing that bit of work I just referred to.
Yeah.
So we're talking about time, short amounts of time that we're given space. So this is a one-day intervention in Manchester Art Gallery. The project was called Still I Rise, based on Maya Angelou's poem. And around 10, 12 artists participated. We brought our work into the gallery for one day, and we had a promenade of an audience because it was performative. It was quite interesting. Visual artists, predominantly visual artists. I have a live art practice, but predominantly visual artists engaged in offering a performative experience around their visual art to an audience, and it was massively popular. Through the day, I think we had about 600 people come through on 3 shifts. It's also very hard work. So I'm going to give a snippet, and I think that the link to the whole film will be shared after this snippet. And also, I'm really engaged in Zoom practice, so it's not going to be clean. In the screen share, you're going to just enjoy the experience of screen sharing on Zoom. So let's have a go. There we are. Yep. And somewhere I have to make the screen big. Whoa, where do I do that? There. Picture in picture. I don't think that's the one. No, that wasn't what I wanted to do. Sorry.
I love technology.
It's performative. I regard it as completely performative. And I'm going to go back a little bit. So we're not just going to start with me, I don't think. Actually, the bit that I wanted to share is a little bit before this artist, Yeah, I'm going to give you snippets. There you go. You're going to be really interactive.
And here, you have questions. You have questions, don't you?
Literally swimming in racist water. So let me connect that to myself. As a result of being raised as a white person in this society, I have a racist worldview. We make it so miserable for people of color. I have developed racist patterns. And I have investments in the system of racism because it's served me really well. It's comfortable. It's helped me overcome the barriers that I do face. And I also have an investment on seeing that.
Look at this. Eve, the first feminist. She is curious, active, independent, and wise. She takes control and responsibility. She's the one confronting the serpents. She is our leader, our heroine.
We have on this slide who makes life.
My brother.
You can hear her. She's crying. My body. It's my temple. This is my body.
I have never ever dreaded death, though its hands have always been more fragile than banality. My fear, however, was of dying
in a land where grave diggers' wages are higher than the price of human freedom. This was the great absence. This was the story of ruin. If only freedom could sing a song, small, small, even smaller than the throat of a bird. It's only truth that is liberating.
Sorry, I'm going to jump through a little bit. To me, obviously.
My work. It's not what it says in your pamphlet. I didn't make the work I thought I wanted to make. I made the work that had to be made. We artists. You have our names in your pamphlet. Here we are for one day only. Down the road at the Whitworth, you can see our collaborations with Alice Kettle until February 2019. That show opened less than 2 weeks ago, alongside another show. 2 exhibitions, 1 preview. The director of the Whitworth spent an hour singing the praises of one of the artists, the white man, and barely 10 minutes acknowledging Alice Kettle, the white female woman. He chose not to mention. He had our names written down on a piece of paper. In the 18th year of the 21st century, it appears the director of the Whitworth, and Manchester Art Gallery, him being one and the same, couldn't do this. Shahire Sharif, Mayok Wong, Mabube Rajabi, Kani Kamul, Ekua Bayunu, Ana Lucia Cuevas.
Right. I've stopped there because you can see the rest of this film, but I realised that I have to go and turn it off. Sorry.
Not to worry. I think.
There we go. I'm back in.
Yeah. I think that was really interesting, and I think one of the reasons that we wanted to have this discussion is to see, first of all, it was to see whether any of our institutions would actually come and talk with us. And I'm so pleased that we do have Louise here. And also to see what is happening amongst Black artists, and in particular Black female artists. How are they expressing themselves? One of the, when you look online, you have a range of different, you use a range of different materials in your actual practice. What is the significance of that, or how do you decide that this is how I'm going to work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm only hearing this, but you said actual practice, and I suppose all my practice is my actual practice.
Exactly, your practice is.
So what's quite interesting,
I don't know how to define.
As a segue from the textiles to textile, is actually I also use textiles a lot in my work, and behind me in that clip was work that I had made in a residency, and it was all fabrics. And again, I have, like many women, an archive of fabric handed down to me from my mother and collected by myself. And it's deliberately, it was all, so my work as well as myself was wrapped in bubble wrap, because it was an absolute statement of the, that there's a two-way privilege. And that given a set of circumstances, I was not prepared to share my work in that space. And that is to do with a level of disrespect that we've received as artists. And it is to do with that imbalance of relationship, that projects are scoped out without consultation with us, and then while they're happening, the feedback, the sort of interaction of evaluation doesn't happen around our needs. So we got interaction, but it was often with an agenda that was being brought in by what the gallery needed. you know, whether it was telling us we couldn't be in a room, you know, or this and that was happening. And that was quite interesting. So it wasn't a two-way dialogue when we were even engaging within that space. So, because I was making new work in the space that we'd been allocated. And in fact, I took that work and I've got an image and burnt it. I took it back to my studio, took it to a bit of empty ground outside the studio and burnt it. And now that was made out of paper, and card, which is another material that I use a lot. And I use that a lot because it's accessible, because you can work at quite a large scale cheaply. A lot of it is economics. It also connected when I returned to practice. So I studied fine art sculpture at St. Martin's a long time ago. And when I turned 50, which is also a long time ago, I gave myself a period of time to come back to full-time practice. And I just re-engaged with some of the tools, the things I'd been doing as an art student in the 80s, just as a sort of methodology to get myself thinking again, to sort of, because I have to think with my hands. Like at the moment, one of the things I'm making is I'm on Zoom all the time. I'm sure we all are. Endless Zoom meetings, artist, politician, grandmother. You know, I sing a lot of songs to my grandson in particular. I'm happy to share Head, Shoulders, Knees and Toes with you if you want. But also when I'm sitting, I have to be making. So my hands are busy and I'm just using paper. I'm writing, you know, if you're in meetings, you're writing notes. I was just turning those notes into art, because if I'm not making art in all the time that I have, and that is always percolating through. So that's a massive part of my practice in this moment in time. And I'm finding it quite interesting in that I'm having occasional conversations with people who are seeing a return to normality in terms of a real craving to go back to a way of working that they did before shutting. And I understand that on one perspective, but there's another bit of me that's sort of horrified. Like this period of time has been an essential part of my practice development, as is the 6 months before that, and the 6 months before that, and the 6 months before that. But there's something about this that is really shaping change in terms of what I'm making. But I don't see it as a huge, you know, it's not like I'm straying off a path. I'm just following the path that's being laid down. So out of that project, a whole series of sort of live performance element has come. I have a drag queen, and she's a queen, because people go, oh, you mean a king? No, but she's a drag queen. I think for you know, if we're exploring sort of gender-based work, there's a whole conversation about what it is to be a woman, a cis woman, a trans woman, whatever, and that women should be participating in that conversation as artists. So I am with a drag queen. I also, in terms of looking at art and protest, I mean, some of the conversations I hope that we'll have today will reflect on, you know, as a sculptor. So I trained as a sculptor, and we're looking at a world where statues are being pulled down. And I'm cheering alongside everyone else that these statues celebrating slave traders and other oppressive practice. You know, what are we doing with them? There's a suggestion that we put them into sort of graveyard of statues that can be a place of learning, where we go and learn instead of celebrating it. We need to not forget. Obviously, we can't say pretend that colonialism, slavery didn't happen. But I think that's a really important conversation for artists to be engaged in, especially artists. I'm a figurative maker. When I'm in my other practice, I make all my work tended to be around a celebration of humanity in all the wonderful ways that we are, you know, tall, short, fat, thin, black, white, whatever, as core to what I believe is the sort of essential beauty of humanity, and my work celebrating that. But, you know, how do we do that in the light of what statues have meant, and who's the artist, and how did that pay for them, and who gets paid for it next? It's a wonderful conversation. I've also been doing a small series of very short videos, and they're called Racism Equals Prejudice Plus Power, because I'm really, really annoyed about how racism is being diluted to being any time prejudice is used between one person and the other, because that is not what racism is. So it's like it's a very simple, and I'd love to share, maybe later I can share it, 2-second video of what that means, because you might have a different idea of what that means. But also, I suppose there's 5 layers to the work that I think which is, for me, art and process is how artists create imagery that supports people on the streets. There's some people, that's all it's about. It's what the artists do in terms of placards and puppets. You know, think of XR, the great role of artists within that. It's how artists work to create, illustrate issues. So people they celebrate us as artists to create images of issues that they want to talk about. There's then artists who create work that overtly, and I say overtly because I think all the work we create does this, but overtly promotes a set of values. So I'm a socialist, and so other socialists will come to me and I want to make work that's about promoting socialist values. There's also work that I think is really important, which is we use the skills that we learn as artists, which is to be experimental, to take risks, to be collaborative, to listen, to shape other people's ideas into our work, and how that supports activism. So that's not so much in what we create, but how we create and the skills that we have. And the fourth is how art in itself, how art making actually helps oppressed people feel the value of who they are. So that sharing art making impacts on their self-worth, on the respect of others, on having a voice, of having a presence, of having a value. Because to me, it's the bottom line. If people are to feel that they can take control, they have to feel that they're valuable enough. And art to me is the tool that does that. So those are the sort of multiple layers. And I don't want to point a finger and say, that's not the only way to do it. That's not the only way. I think it's there. It's that multiplicity of that. There we go.
And I think that's really sort of why, certainly the value of art is something why BlackFest started, the value of the artists. It's one of our themes and one of our beliefs as well. Your discussion on statues and the outdoor space leads us neatly on to introducing Ola. Ola is actually Dr. Ola Uduku. She is the professor and joint head of the School of Architecture in Manchester. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself as well.
Oh dear. Well, I was the joint head. I'm now back to being what I do like doing, just academia and research. But yes, I think Susie and I go a long way back. I do remember a textile exhibition at the Africa 2000 event we had in Liverpool in 2000. And we had Ali Mazri as our keynote speaker. It was amazing. And indeed, as Ekwa says, there's very little mention in the general Liverpool press. But I think for those of us who attended the event, it was just amazing.
It was actually fabulous, wasn't it? We took over the venue.
So it continues in whatever form. And I guess call out as well, Black History Month this year, I'm helping coordinate the 75th anniversary of the Pan-African Congress being held in Manchester. And again, it's been a hard job to get the institutions to get behind it. But again, we all know how critical that event was, although it did seem to be rather limited in the females that were there, but Mrs. Marcus Garvey was there. But again, it's these events that don't fit, I would say, within the general, the canon of events that are quote unquote important.
Ola, could I ask you to pop the details of that event in the chat?
I will. Yeah, I'll do that. We're still pulling it together. I'll do that. But yeah, I think I'm here to talk a bit about, indeed, memorials, buildings, statues, and things. So I'll wait to be questioned by the questioner, Susie.
Right.
Go ahead.
What role can architecture play within protests?
Right. Well, I mean, that was one that threw me, but I mean, I think very much in terms of what the architecture and the space stands for. So if I were to take you through journeys, I mean, I guess my first stop would be somewhere like South Africa. District 6 used to be a mixed neighborhood. Apartheid comes along. To cut a long story short, in the 1960s, those who were not white were moved, and it was given a new name. But again, religiously, they couldn't actually deconsecrate or get rid of the churches. So fast forward, post-apartheid, there's now a District 6 museum, which has the names of all the streets that were erased in this apartheid period. But it's not just the museum, it stands as a monument to that space. And in a way it stood in defiance and protest, despite the area being called, I think, Triomphe. It never really, the identities and the memories of the people were held in that building. So it stood as both the protest and the memorial space. And I think that's been a way in which buildings have over time, because buildings are much more permanent, they do hold those memories. But also I could go to the present, 2018, it's called the National Lynching Memorial in Alabama. Again, it gives the history to a very, very painful past. And in itself, it's become more important, apart from the fact that Martin Luther King walked through Alabama, than many of the other things that Alabama was known for, particularly its whole history in slavery and so on. But this building, again, holds the memories of what it was like to live in the segregated South. And there are memorials, there are other memorials that I could mention. So sometimes they're new memorials that are built, other times they are buildings that embody the memories of people. And I guess as a person of West African origin, I guess the issue is for us, oftentimes the buildings don't last that long anyway. So it's sometimes the trees, the monuments, the spaces that have this embodied memory, which in themselves stand for something, but often are also the space or the spirit in which the protest took place. If we could come right up to now, obviously the squares, you think about Tahrir Square in Cairo, Taksim Square in Istanbul, Tiananmen Square. But I think, you know, it's that interesting link between the space being formal, but what it actually does and how people use that space in certain times.
Thank you. The next question. Has the idea of civic space and therefore the right to protest been designed out of public spaces?
I think there's been a push to try to do it. Whether it actually works is a different case. But yes, I mean, I think probably since the neoliberals, since the post-60s, a lot of the architecture has been around creating spaces, but spaces for whom? So we're asking the same questions. So obviously you're in Liverpool, Liverpool won. I actually was in Liverpool when it was being planned, and that discussion was about, you know, who gets access to these spaces? Because when you privatize the space, it's not even not for the likes of us. Legally, the land then becomes not public land. And architecturally as well, you know, there are, I mean, again, among some of our institutions, which will remain nameless, there are spaces where, you know, you can't even sit down because indeed the architecture means that it would be uncomfortable to sit down. You certainly couldn't kip for the night in certain parts of, you know, all our major cities. So there has been that push. But then I think there's been a pushback as well. There's a lot more indeed in terms of what's called community-based architecture, where there are movements to have people come into the spaces. But I think our North European cousins in Scandinavia and so on have been much more successful in having these spaces that become owned by the community, which again, going back to African tradition, is not unusual. Wale Soyinka talks about being looked after by the entire community, that his parents would go out because they were, I think, they're school teachers or whatever. But, you know, you leave a child in a kind of compound area in lots of Africa, West Africa, they're cared by the community. But in terms of formal architecture, there has been that push to formalize everything and indeed privatize space, which we're trying to push back against. Again, back to now, I think the post-new COVID normal, where we're hoping to have much more give to the to cities, to have more than just the cars. So this mix between hopefully bicycles, walking and so on, we'll see how long that actually stays in place. Because I'm with Ekwa, I found these 6 months a pause, and I think it would be a shame if going back to normal means that some of the gains we've had in terms of how we use our cities and our spaces just go back to whatever normal is. I mean, I think that's something we really need to push back against.
Yes, I think you're right there, because when people were cycling and walking, the way space took on a different sort of meaning, and people's behaviours changed. People actually engaged and talked to people who they didn't know, you know, and they were talking on friendly terms. It wasn't, people weren't hostile in the way that they may have been before.
Well, I mean, it's the whole thing. Well, again, Manchester is the city of the Industrial Revolution, more or less. I mean,
Yes, yes.
We seem to forget that the car is only about 100 years old, but it dominates the city, you know. And, you know, we're all in this time and motion study. You've got to be there at 9, leave at 5. But I think time has actually gone into a different sequence, which, you know, I think people are more comfortable with, actually, which is this thing about how we look at both the time and the space. There's a book, Time, Space and Architecture, how we actually inhabit these spaces, which is different from what we had to do before. I mean, I was a perennial commuter. I still do, well, I still may have to commute, but I found that slowing down actually very, very therapeutic. I'm not sure I've been that creative, but I've certainly had time to at least think, which is good.
Massive part of the creative process.
Does anybody else want to ask any questions of Ola?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite interested in that. I mean, I'm endlessly interested in architecture, actually, just anyway. And there was an initiative, I can't remember, there's the two universities and I get them mixed up, about the Feminist School of Architecture, about just a completely different way of addressing how women participate in architecture. But I suppose some of the things that I've seen that I'm really impressed with is around, I don't even know where it was, but I visited a building that had been designed after observing the footfall of the people on the campus. And so all its doorways and its pathways and everything reflected that. And I found that really fascinating. But then when you were talking more, I was just imagining if you were an architect and you were asked, for instance, to create public space where kettling, which we know, you know, in terms of controlling crowds and protests, where kettling was more efficiently carried out, how would you address that? You know, are you teaching your students, or are there modules where you talk about the, you know, how do you have a moral and ethical and ideological base as an architect if the public bodies who are probably going to people who are going to be employing you used to do something like that? So I'm sending it back there. Is it a quandary? Is it being addressed? And how is it being addressed?
I think it is. I mean, nowadays there are some very interesting studios. So the architecture course is incredibly long. Basically, it'll take you about 7 years to get out the other side. So to begin with, you get the bits that are important, because architects, like doctors, don't want to kill you. So you want an architect who knows that will actually make sure your building stands up.
Yeah.
So you get through that bit, and then you get into what's increasingly becoming an exploratory phase where you've got different studios. So I think the feminist architecture, there's an interesting correlation. I think Sheffield had a very strong feminist steer, but we actually have a studio called Praxis at Manchester School of Architecture, shout out Praxis. And that really is looking at things from a feminist point of view, or at least in a non, if you like, white male point of view. And they have students from not just feminist dispositions, but looking at things differently. And they actually, in terms of the Manchester School of Architecture, they have actually pushed the Black Lives Matter movement more than any of the other studios. So you do have that chance to explore. I have a colleague who works almost exclusively with Manchester around aging communities, and that he actually works, his students and the team work with aging people of age and they discuss what kind of architecture they would like to have. And, you know, there are real commissions that have come out of that. So I think in a way architecture has been dragged in some ways into exploring more than, again, the standard canon. And I think that will be very interesting, because again, I think the next generation of architects are much more engaged. So we're talking about the generation, there's an X, Y, Z, but also the issues have come to the fore. And I think for most architects now, I think that's the difference. In the old days, I guess, if you wanted to be a star architect, you had to do things in a certain way, which probably involved designing pre-epic tall buildings. I think nowadays there's a very much, I call it a wide tent, a large tent. You can decide on what area of architecture you want to engage with in great detail. And you might not make the millions, but I think ethically you can actually feel comfortable, because I think that's been, again, when I hit 50, but when I hit 40, I thought, you know, it's about the people coming ahead, coming below me and encouraging them. When I reached 50, it was a case of, when I'm doing things, can I go to bed at night and feel I can sleep and feel comfortable? I think that ethical push in architecture is really coming through. We're getting, I guess, the equivalence of the Greta Thunbergs in the architecture field, where it's sustainable, who's actually driving it, the ethics, again, particularly for me as a person who has African connections. I've sort of said, so if I ever hear of another set of students going to build a school in Africa, I don't want to hear about it. You know, we've had schools for the last 200 years. So there's both the neo-colonial, are you having a good time there, or are you actually, you know, there's discussions that we can start to have. And I think that's becoming, you know, that in the old days, that was the odd one, but nowadays there are lots of opportunities, particularly at the senior level of your architecture training, where you can start to think about these things in more detail. So I think architecture is in a better place. We don't have enough women. We certainly don't have enough people of color, but I think these things are being challenged. So,
do you think there's room for architects I mean, I think this is across all art forms.
Yeah.
One of the ways of that, the sort of traditional method of teaching and education is to separate us all off into silos. And I think at this moment in time, when there's a real need for us to unite, particularly about articulating and pushing for equality, freedom, right, you know, justice, for us to work across art forms, and just that I think there are some specifics in different art forms that make that more difficult. But I'm just wondering what would be the way in for working with architects in that way, and that sort of broad, not just broad architecture thing, but broader art.
Cross-disciplinarity. Well,
Yeah.
again, that's what the schools of art were supposed to do, but there has been that. I think there's always the tension, and good schools of art actually have some of that crossover happening. Probably not enough for us all, but there are these interstices where these things happen. And I think back to my earlier comment actually about the TATE, I think some of it is actually going in really early at almost primary school stage, and sort of getting children involved in art in all its manifestations and working through. So, you know, it's not this thing about when they reach age 15, 16, it's do I do art and what kind of art? Yeah. So again, I would hark back to the Scandinavians to an extent, where a lot of these things work together and they have a better gender balance as well, actually. I think it was Finland I was at, and I think more than 50% of their artists were women anyway. You know, that's kind of Marimekko land and so on and so forth. But you find, you know, the real balance between female architects, male architects, and so on. So it's not seen as unusual. But then if you look right back to even nursery school, you find more men caring for women, for their kids, than women. So it's a very equal society that runs through and then manifests itself in areas like art practice and so on. So I think there's a lot of work we all need to do about sort of demystifying, but also saying, you know, art is more than just a specific discipline. You can do a series of things.
I think that's also something which we as parents and aunts and grandparents need to also communicate to our young people, because, you know, certainly I come from a West African background, and my family and my siblings our generation are unusual. We're not doctors, we're not lawyers, we're not accountants or that sort of thing. Sorry?
Architects.
Oh, architects.
Another story. Yeah. The rest of my family are medical. You know, I was the rat. I was supposed to do medicine.
Me too.
But it didn't appeal. I mean, there's something. I came into art because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I became sort of aware of art as being powerful when I started doing workshops, and the only way I could get into, I realized how political the work I was doing, just going back to the late 80s, early 90s, that when I went into a school, and it was in primary schools, secondary schools, I was getting all sorts of strange questions about the fabrics that they were handling in the handling collection. Like, oh, do they have sewing machines in Africa? And clearly holding, you're laughing, Ola, but still to this day, that is a question. And I found that I couldn't, when I went in, I also had to do the re-education as well, and say, look, rather than tell them, get them to examine the article and say, well, how is it made? Can you see whether it's been hand sewn or not? And they'll go, oh yes, it's been made by a sewing machine. But the first question is one of deprivation or poverty or lack of means of whatever description. I then realised how powerful it was as me as a Black woman going into a school, knowing that I'm the minority and presenting myself. And my power was, I used to go wearing traditional dress, and then I stopped that because conversation changed. People stopped listening to what I was saying and talking about what I was wearing. So I normally go in ordinary sort of everyday clothing, and as part of my performance, become an African woman and test what they thought of me then. I would sort of say, well, when you first saw me, what did you think? And they would give their response. Then I would go into the performance and wrap myself, not with bubble wrap, but with a wrapper, which is the length of fabric worn as a skirt. And you would see on their faces the change of attitude and the change of regard in which they saw me. And I'd say to them, right, had I arrived like this, what would you have thought about me? What were the things that you would have thought? And they will say, oh, well, we thought you're not from here, or you come from another country, you're not part of our society. And then I said, well, I speak like this. Is this something that you would expect me, how you would expect me to speak? And no, you should have an accent, and all these, literally just unpacking it. And that's the reaction in a 5-10 minute presentation. And, that's really, I saw the power and how really it is activism, proper activism going in. And I think that is, as an art, the power of the fabric came over in that. I think education is very much part of it, and that's about enabling people to participate in art activities. A piece of work that I've been doing, I'm a student at Manchester Met still, apparently, and I keep trying to get rid of it and it keeps coming back. And my work around there was about looking at activities that can be taken into school so that we can address have some of these discussions, but also reduce the need for remedial lessons to take children out of the classroom.
It's really interesting actually when you talk about schools, because I actually think particularly primary schools were doing really well, really well in terms of that, particularly in terms of young people's engagement in their creativity and bringing that creativity across the curriculum. And what we're seeing now is actually an encouragement of this government and changing that and a real, one of the comrades I've been working with, her child's just gone back to school like everybody's house, and they're going straight into testing. So they're a 7-year-old from lock-in, and the child is ill from stress tummy, and it's like, what on earth are we doing, and what's that about? And that wasn't, there was, I think, an amazing, because I think when my kids were in school, there was some real negativity, and then I started working with what was then called creative partnerships, and I saw some really good work of art across curriculum. And it's like it's going backwards. And I think we need to acknowledge the really good work that has happened within schools so that we can help those teachers who are fighting for it to continue to fight for it by acknowledging it. But the other thing when it's come to my relationship with education is,
I think art, music, a lot of that education is being cut out of the curriculum.
Yeah.
Which, you know,
and a lot of that is class-based decisions.
Exactly.
Like,
I think that's, yeah.
you know, it's about saying this, the massive working class do not need to know anything except how to go into a factory and earn us loads of money.
Precisely.
That is the real problem. It's the difference between instruction and education. But my personal experience reflects that when we're talking about class and about working class. So most of the time, in terms of working on a workshop, most of us will have a workshop practice as an artist as a way of earning money, but also I did it from joy. I worked in some of the most vulnerable and underprivileged communities who are full of privilege of wonderful other things, but not financial resources like housing and employment, important, and good health. And then the one time I stepped out of that, I got asked to deliver workshops in WOMAD. Very odd experience, because the first time I had children, so I'm talking about working in the East End of London, working in sort of North Edinburgh, and all over the place, the eastern part of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. Anyway, I got WOMAD, and this young man is obviously very polite, and he went, "Are you a student?" I'm like, "No," because I'm a big grown woman. And he went, "Are you a visitor?" And he'd obviously been prepped to go to WOMAD, that he was going to meet these others. It was a polite, and he was going to be polite and lovely, and they would be visitors to our country or coming as students. And I was just imagining this conversation this child had been given to prep him to be, you know, non-racist in this sort of wonderful atmosphere of WOMAD. And I was at the receiving end of, "Are you a student?" No. And I was like, "Get me back to Pilton," is what I said, where I felt, you know, much more comfort. I never got those sorts of questions. And was because I hadn't had that since, you know, we all were, I taught life drawing once in an adult ed when adult ed existed. And, you know, anyone who came in from the institution looking for the tutor would literally walk past me to the, I mean, I was only a sort of 20-year-old, the sort of middle-aged white person who was in the room. I just used to watch them go by and just let them do it until they'd made a fool of themselves, and then go, "Yes, it's me, I'm the tutor."
Yeah, I think talking about figurative workshops and things, that leads us nicely back full circle to our main discussion, which is around the Black Lives Matter protests and the toppling of the Colston statue. And really, what we wanted to find out is, this is really open to everybody, what do you feel is the future of monuments and art within the public realm? I'm thinking sort of public art in the spaces. And have these events affected you personally as, or how have these events affected you personally as artists? And I'm going to go to Selena first. Was that one?
Well, I was thinking about it, and I think like Eka was saying, you know, when it was being toppled, you're there and you're cheering, and it was kind of like a moment of elation, because I think, you know, it'd been quite tense at that time, and to see like these quite public displays of things going down. And I was thinking that in regards of like me and monuments, and like how I don't really pay them any attention, because I think, you know, especially when in the city that you live in, like I probably know that they're there, but I don't know they're there, if you know what I mean. Because I think, oh, they're just like some old white people probably did something terrible, some kind of colonial past, and I know they're there, but I don't pay attention to them unless somebody pointed them out. So I think it was the part of like seeing it topple, seeing people knowing that, and then it kind of brought attention to them in an educating way. And like Eka was saying, like we're going to put them in like or it might have been an old saying, put them in a graveyard, and, you know, like you don't want to topple them and get rid of them, because then that literally erases all the issues. Because like there's the conversation now within Liverpool about street names and putting up, shall we, you know, say why this name is called that, and like, you know, do people do tours of buildings and be like, if you look at like the town hall, this has got these certain faces on, this is built by Black people who were enslaved. So I think it's a great way of drawing attention to them if you're educating that, like saying like, so people like, I didn't even know that was, or why that statue was there. So if, you know, yeah, we'll topper them, but we need to know why they're there and not celebrate them, but learn about them. Because I think a lot of people will probably surprise and realise, you know, many people say like Britain isn't racist, it's not got this racist history, which is just obviously completely ridiculous. But I think it is also opened up the question of what public art should we have, and I think we do need more public art that, you know, is by artists and represents the communities in those areas, and is something that I would probably pay attention to, and not just be like, I don't know what that is, birds just poo on it, you know. I'll meet you by that statue, I don't know what it is, but I'll meet you there, sort of thing. Yeah, I think that was kind of my emotions around it and my feelings.
How about you, Akua?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really open to this conversation at the moment, because when I first, you see, for me, it's something strangely European anyway, about this fixing, the fixed nature of art making and statues and stuff. So when the Colston came down and was thrown into the canal river, it is a continuation of its art, of its being, as far as I'm concerned. It exists in a time and space, and actually I think it would have been much more useful to leave it in the river for at least a period of time, because that was part of its legacy, it being toppled and put in the river. To leave it there would be a reminder of the action, just as having it there was a reminder of the action of the person and the other people who, you know, chose to honor them in that way. So I have I understand this idea of having a graveyard, so not getting rid of them because we need to acknowledge that history happened. But then I think the trouble with graveyards is that we don't visit them very much, and we don't go and hang out in them, and we don't, you know, it's like they can be easily forgotten and get covered in weeds, and then how useful would that be? So as I'm talking about it, it's almost live, and because I have that idea of that artwork doesn't have to be fixed, I would much rather see a series of commissions where we change and shape them and share where they're coming from and what paid for them, and then what is the next stage of their manifestation. So that say if Colston hadn't happened, he was there actually, because the protests about him had been going on for years and years. It wasn't a brand new thing. It wasn't just sparked off. You know, we haven't just known, oh, we're oppressed and we didn't notice until, you know, we had mobile phones that could video our oppression. We've sort of known about it. It's just, it's gotten a little bit more global. But something like, I don't know, an interaction, you know, I think it would have been much more exciting to just cover it with African fabric. I know how to do that, to make it permanent. I know exactly the materials, you know, to actually fit, because like you say, though you say you don't notice them, you don't know what they're about, actually the reality of that is their strength. It's that subliminal message of the power and the right of white men to rule us. So just taking it away, I don't think that's strong enough, not to create the shift and change of mind culture that we need. Covering them with kente, that would be something, wouldn't it? That would be lovely. You know, playing with their gender, that would be exciting. Playing with race, gender, size, all that. I think it's about more art and stopping this idea of a fixed nature. So that, let's see how long that would last, our kente covered Colston. Let's see how long, you know, and maybe in 20 years something else would happen, or, you know, or probably what will happen, because I see the state of the world not being very positive, it would all be scraped off again and they would be painted gold and let's go back to worshipping white men. That's where I stand on this.
I think it's a very interesting idea of reimagining problematic statues. Yeah, I'm quite taken with that idea. Even if it's not the original statue, it's something which actually would be quite useful in a sort of cathartic sort of way, and certainly in terms of generating new art. And
debate as well. I mean,
and debates,
because do remember there was that temporary statue that went up as well.
Yes.
But I mean, I think the issue is that it was a very, very visceral act, and it was amazing to actually see it. And I agree with Ekwa. You don't normally see the toppling off effectively venerated figures such as he would have been in his day or whatever. on your public screen.
Yeah, especially in Europe.
Exactly, by the use of the mobile phone. And I think it
Yeah.
did actually. I mean, it was performative and it was visceral. You know, I wasn't necessarily, I think I was just shocked because, again, in the UK, I mean, that is the whole issue about the fixity of the statue and what it stands for, to see it topple. But I think the issue is it is already opening up debate, and that debate has to continue. I mean, you know about Edinburgh at the moment. The major debate is our good friend Dundas. You know, Dundas, because again, you've got this cultures in the UK itself, because Scotland was never racist. Oh yes, it was.
Oh God.
Or that Robert Burns would have been an overseer in a slave plantation. A lot of Scots just go white, literally. So there are these histories that are coming up, and I think, you know, I think the success of that event, the performance, is that it's made us question these statues. I mean, even in Manchester, there's only a tiny statue of Emily Pankhurst, and we all know the brouhaha that went through the Mary Seacole statue at the hospital. So I think the idea about what the statue means, particularly in the context of, well, the UK that we're in, is absolutely critical. And we need to have these debates. We have to discuss these things, because otherwise, I'd say Selina's a slightly different generation from the rest of us here. People just pass them by. And those of us who are kind of geeky enough to know a bit about the past, we sort of go, oh, well, you guys just don't know your history and so on. But to bring it out there has meant that we've got to deal with it. And we've got to engage with it in some way. Whether it's by textiles and so on, but it has actually made people actually focus on it. I mean, I certainly didn't know the whole history of Colston, so that was new to me, you know. So I think by doing that, and then it is a three-dimensional object, it gives, again, space for others to occupy and discuss.
Yeah. I mean, I'd quite like to talk about that statue that was put up to replace the Colston. Because obviously it had its own brouhaha about it, because it turned out to be the making of a white male sculptor who people felt his eye was very much the male eye of women. So that was, you know, that is going to be an interesting, again, debate if we're talking about commissioning work to either replace or new work or whatever that conversation is. Yeah. We do need to look at who makes that work and why they make it and how they benefit from it. And how, I mean, that then it begins to have that whole conversation about what, you know, the way that, as I said, that primary schools have been impacted upon, as artists have been really impacted upon by the sort of cult of the superstar artist, and everybody wanting to be blooming Tracy Emin, or, you know, and it's just like, how do we differentiate in terms of, or how do we actually hold back in terms of what I'm going to call the real role of an artist is. So what do you think about the sculpture that was put in place of the Colston?
Oh, it's the main issues were, as you said, about how it got there. I mean, how did it get there? Where did the money come for it? Who knew it was going to be fixed? Because it's hardly something that can be done secretly.
Reasonably, I do think you just made it and shoved it up there. You just need a ladder, don't you?
It looked
huge. For me, I had more problems about the actual aesthetic. It was a very sanitized version of a revolutionary black woman. It was very gender normative. It was very size normative. You know, there was so much about it that was very obviously a sort of cis white male view of a black woman.
I feel like it speaks volumes of just like a white man to just take a statue and shove it up there without asking anybody. Hey, black people, do you know what you need? This statue I've made. Here we go.
Like, that in itself is an example of the power.
Yeah. It's like,
entitlement, sense of
entitlement. Yeah.
And also safety. You know, literally. You know, we literally have to negotiate a world that is not as safe for us, you know, in terms of, you know, especially during COVID, it's become even more, give the police a few more powers, and who do they use them against? You know, statistically, we know that, you know, particularly African heritage people have just been at the receiving end of more brutality, police injustice than ever before. So we also don't have the safety to be able to do. I mean, we exercise it. I'm not saying that we're cowering in fear, but yeah, there are different things that we have to take on board before we can take those sorts of actions.
I do think that the toppling of the statue and then the replacement, which nobody asked for, have like opened up a conversation about public art and like who makes public art, why is there not more? Because then I think there was a story, I can't remember the artist, but it was like the first Black artist, I think, then had a statue put up in somewhere in London, and it was the fact that like nobody thinks about who put it there, who made it, or who it's by. And I think more people will think about that now, especially as it is like it's been brought to the forefront. It's like, well, who put that there? Who asked for that? Or is it just some art by another, you know, white man, like a rich white man? Why is that there? Is that representative of artists in this area? You know, I think hopefully, I'm thinking that will raise more conversation around that.
Yeah.
But,
and what do we want from our allies? You know, we're going to have to hope that there are also white men who are prepared to be our allies in this struggle. So what do we want them to do?
Yeah, because I think
from the side.
A lot of my whole shtick is my practice, my being is like taking up space, and this is like literally taking up public space. And if those isn't being taken up by the people that don't get offered to take up the space, then what is the point? If it's being taken up, space being taken up by people that take up the space all the time, then nothing is really changing. And that's basically what the replacement statue was. It's like, this is a statue of a black woman, but it's literally a white man taking up a space of a white man. It's like, not what we wanted.
Yeah, I think this is actually probably a good point for Louise to sort of come back into the conversation. And, you know, what is the sort of impact on cultural organisations? What has been the impact?
I mean, I don't say this lightly, but it's been absolutely massive. You can feel the tectonic plates are shifting almost daily, and I really don't say that lightly. I think for me, I was really struck with the impatience of institutional change, which I think institutions take a long time to shift, and policies need to be rewritten. And it's like I'm sitting next to the Mersey, it's like the cruise ships turning round. You need the tugboat to be pulling them. And I think for me, what's been really exciting actually is the impatience with that organizational shift. And we need a speedboat. We don't need the tugboat anymore. We need to be really acting with change. And that's, for TATE, it's things like setting up, we have a BAME task force which has been working really hard over the last few years, but we have a race equality task force that's been set up, which is to make active recommendations quickly to both the executive group and the trustees. So that was a voluntary group, so it's made up with half people of colour from the organisation and half of people who would identify as white, and that is to collectively listen and to make changes at all levels throughout the institution. Other things that we're doing kind of in quite a real way is, I think I mentioned before, we're totally re-looking at our events programme. We are readdressing how we invite people into the organisation, so that could be through our TATE Collective Producers Scheme, which is our young people's programme, aged 16 to 24, who have the opportunity to curate programmes that we have here. But we're, again, as I said before, not just assuming that people know about this, but thinking about where we advertise, what the offer is, making sure that it's very clear that when we go out to people that there are fees paid, and there is not the assumption that or kind of awkwardness that people should have to ask for a fee. You know, we're just being incredibly mindful of that position of the institution, and making sure that we're reflecting on that in every single, you know, all of our actions. And I don't say this to say, you know, look how all the great work that we've been doing, but just to say that we are incredibly mindful of that change and what needs to happen, and what needs to happen quickly.
How's that impacting sort of retrospectively? So the thing that I was talking about when we submitted the Still I Rise as a model, not as a repeat of the same thing, was when the Tate did it was the first time I think they did a region-wide call out to look at working with more regional, because the criticism was that, you know, working with international artists, not working with regional artists.
Yeah.
But how is, so that was, you know, I know that institutions have to work over a long period of time and a long period of investment. So how is that new thinking impacting on old programming?
So I think you may be referring to, could be possibly a Tate Exchange program. I don't know. It was before my time. It would be interesting maybe after the call to figure out exactly
last year, I think.
Yeah. So we are currently looking at what that offer is. So of course, as with all institutions, all our events and all our programming is going online. So Tate Exchange as a program of our strand is existing online, and they are being joined with the Tate Modern program. So there'll be a digital platform for Tate Exchange. But we are absolutely readdressing about what physical space do we need here in Tate Liverpool? How can that best serve artists? We will be speaking with artists and the people who want to use those spaces about what they actually need. I was really struck by what you were talking about before. You know, there was a kind of dislocation between what the organisation wanted and what the artists wanted, and I think us really listening to that is incredibly important. Was it perhaps Art Northwest was what you were referring to?
Possibly. So
this is a new commission opportunity that will is across the Northwest, and that the first artist was appointed last year. We've had slight delays on that because of the impact of the programme on COVID, but we will be going out again for a new call quite shortly, because it will be in 2023. But we're going to really look at how that process was last time, readdress that, and see if we can do that with much more of a kind of equitable position.
Cool. I mean, I'm going to just mention it now because I am a member of Artists Union England, and we're right in the process of writing a good practice charter, and I'm leading in an area looking particularly around diversity and as an African heritage woman, that you know, is an area. And also because I think specifically of the impact of both COVID on our communities and the Black Lives Matter movement coinciding, I would really like to have a conversation about that good practice charter.
Absolutely.
And also to let everybody here join a union, Artists Union England.
Yes. We'd be delighted to have those conversations, of course, with you, with anyone. Absolutely.
Ola, I'm going to sort of pose the same question to you about the impact of the Black Lives Matter on cultural organisations, since you work within a cultural organisation.
I'm not sure whether the university would consider itself, well, it is cultural.
It is.
I think it is really interesting because, again, I mean, you know my history. I've been in academe for longer than I would like to remember. And I think it has been an event. Well, I mean, COVID's obviously been a major event, but also the whole Black Lives Matter. And again, taking on my analytical view, we know that Black lives have been disproportionately affected by the effects of COVID. So the George Floyd thing is an example from elsewhere. There are probably a significant number of George Floyd incidents, maybe not as brutal, but we don't really know because, I mean, it might not be outright shooting, but certainly Black lives have been impacted a lot by these events. And all credit to, I would say, the new generation of students who are really have brought up this issue. So the Cass School of Architecture in London has changed its name because of the links it had to, again, slavery and so on. So a lot of students have actually taken up the cause, which in my academic history, which again is long, I haven't really seen. Okay, climate change has had a similar effect on a kind of possibly a wider strata of students, but Black students and their allies have been up there asking what universities are doing about this. And in a way, I would say that in itself is a cultural change in terms of how our students are engaging with us. Then on the other side, which I'm part of, I guess, certainly when I was head of school, or joint head of school, which I stepped down from, to be honest, there was a bit of a freeze moment in a lot of institutions. And those of us who were or who are people of colour have had to actually, again, come from under the parapet and start asking searing questions. We're not getting all the answers we want. But again, I think this is a change point in how we deal with higher education in the UK. We're, as usual, slightly a step behind, particularly East Coast American institutions that our Russell Group and Oxbridge set of schools see ourselves as being, you know, in the forefront of. And there's a lot of very interesting practice amongst, you know, the Princetons and the Columbias and so on. We're not quite there yet, but I think the questions are being asked. And again, this is the thing, I don't think we can go back to whatever the normal was. It's just that, back to your tank ideology again, to move a tank is difficult. But I think we're starting, the discussion is starting. I think I've been in the institution, and I guess I have finally come up to over the glass ceiling, because basically when you're in the professoriate, you've, I guess, vaguely arrived. I can ask questions I certainly couldn't have asked 20 years ago about what's going on in terms of employment, in terms of curriculum, and these things are all being challenged. I think some institutions are using every possible way to sort of delay, but a lot of institutions are realizing that actually the next generation will not be signing up to their institutions unless some of these questions can be answered. So that's positive, because I think it's wider than just the arts sector, but certainly the arts sector, which again, unfortunately, has been historically white, particularly in higher education, has had to start answering difficult questions about what it's doing. And it's that thing again about, I guess, creating that space, which Ekwa has been saying, and indeed as Selina is saying as well. I mean, it can no longer just be this middle class ghetto. There's a bigger discussion about what pedagogy is. So really from, I was saying, nursery right through to higher education. I mean, we've inherited what effectively is a class system. Let's make no mistake about it. And again, that disproportionately affects those who are not of a certain strata. But going forward, whatever is going to be the British Isles, we're going to have to begin to take down some of these structural issues. And higher education, again, there's a light being shone on that, particularly at the moment. And yeah, I'm happy to see the movement move through. But I do think actually it's those coming through, which again are those who I feel I should be supporting, who are going to really push for that change, because it's a much more multicultural discussion about what we need. And I hope we all get space and equal space, which is not the situation at the moment.
I know that when I used to be very active within the trade union, and we had self-organisation really to enable people of colour to actually have the space to discuss the issues or the impact of issues and decisions that were going to be made that had an impact on them. And at Manchester, I know, was it last year that they started a discussion with students in a forum, a Black forum, which that was the first, well, was that the first time, Ola? That they,
I mean, I was still quite new, but I think so. I mean, they had always had a whatever diversity group, but I think that's the first time again it had been foregrounded. So it was sort of, yeah. And
I know, as I say, I'm sort of one of the over 50s, and I remember sort of back in the day that people met and organised. People, I mean, my influences in my art were people like Sonia Boyce, were people like Rashini Kempadu, were people like, you know, that generation were the people I was looking up to, and they actually influenced how I thought about my art, about how and where it was and it was placed. And you know, I don't know about you, Akua, whether those sort of movements, other movements that are coming, sort of the Black art movement, I didn't know that I was working within the movement at the time. And those were my influences. But with the Black Lives Matter, that again is also coming to the fore. And I think it's sort of really important that we as older artists are part of that education, are part of that discussion with the younger artists as well. I don't know what people think about that.
I mean, I think we definitely need to, I mean, any sort of collaborative getting together conversation movement needs to address age, gender, sexuality. I'm not sure if, and ages, you know, all of them have their own complexities in terms of how they interact and how you get intersections of oppression within that, disability obviously as well. It's interesting because yes, I mean, I'm 60 next year, so I'm really into my 50s. And what I found really weird is I suppose I did sort of perceive the beginning of a sort of Black arts movement. And what I then experienced was also the beginning, end and middle, because it felt like all those artists who were coming to maybe my attention, but also to the attention of the wider art world when I was at art school, there felt like over a sort of 30-year period, there were no others. It's a really weird process to reflect on. And then in maybe the last 5 years, with the emergence of the sort of diversity pavilion in Venice, you had some of the younger artists, and then, you know, some of the tragedies of what happened with Grenfell impacting on that. And, you know, that is part of our wider story as well. So I think it's really important, but it's important for us to go, because I feel part of that movement, but I'm part of that invisible bit, you know, and, you know, age, you know, I mean, there are artists now that it would be good to connect in, like with Labena up in Lancaster, and you know, other artists who reached that prominence. There was the Thin Black Line, and then what happened at Whitechapel, and then it just seemed to disappear. I remember I have a very strange art journey. So briefly, I was the chief exec at the New Art Exchange, and I remember now my age is showing because I had his name, and it just Godfrey Donker coming and doing an exhibition. And at that point, which is only, well, it's probably reaching, yeah, it actually is probably a little while ago. I'm gonna say only, and then I realized it's probably only 15 years ago. Anyway, he said he'd never been asked to talk about his work in a university art setting ever. And, you know, we thinking of him as his prominence and his work and the impact it has in terms of the genealogy and where it's going. But for him, you know, he was being completely ignored. I mean, that hopefully has changed, but that was a real sort of like eye-opener in terms of, you know, what is it about organizational structures that need to change? Absolutely. And one of the big chasms as to why they won't change. So I worked within a theatre for a while, and at a senior management level as well. And I would be going to lots of conversations. How do you diversify? How do we do this? How do we do that? And ultimately I had to say, well, one of the biggest things you have to do is you're going to have to lose your job. And because there's all white people asking me, and you're going to have to give, you know, some of those jobs and those senior management jobs, not just, oh, honestly, yet another junior traineeship for somebody who's an emerging artist, you know, because there's only so much change you can make with an institution if you come in at that level. But it's not very popular, you know, like if I'm going to say, Louise, the way you're going to really affect change is give me a job. I don't want a job, but you know what I mean? It's not going to go down very well. But I
think you're right. Turkeys will not vote for Christmas. But then you sort of look at the BBC, you know.
Yes. Yeah. Look at the BBC. Yeah. And look at the journey of people through it. And also, you know, look at our mental health in terms of these aren't fun places to work either. You know, they're not fun workplaces for women in academia and in institutions. It's bloody worse if you're Black women. And I'm gonna put my hand out for here. By Black, I mean anyone from a community that's impacted by white imperialism. So for me, I'm African heritage, and Black encompasses, and I don't use of color. I don't get it. Yeah. I'm just saying it. Just having to pity. Other people are using that term. I'm going.
Yeah, no, but yeah, actually, I agree with that definition. The Unison, I think, have a definition that is really helpful, and it's been drawn out. Yes, Louise.
I feel like I should say something about the employment of TATE. I mean, of course, it's very difficult, and we need change at all levels within the institution for anything of significance to change. So we are we're kind of using and consulting specialist recruitment agencies when opportunities come up. We are trying to make our not just the recruitment policy, but the panels diverse as well. So again, as Selena was saying, in order for you to be part of a change, you have to see that change. And I don't want to have just white panels interviewing for staff at TATE. But also the panels that we host, I don't want to just have a white panel as part of our public program. We can think about how we employ artists throughout the many opportunities that we have here, and I think we have to just work really much harder at finding those opportunities within the organisation, because they are there. It could be the graphic design commission for one of our late events, or it could be a senior management position, but we do have opportunities. I think there's an easiness of using people who you've always used because they understand the system. So, let's get that person in. They know how to operate within the organisation. It could be easier. I don't want to see any of that work happening again. I want us to really be questioning who we can offer our opportunities up for, and I think that can be from senior management to the casual workforce that we use, but have great opportunities to commission new work from. So but yeah, you can have my job.
I can't anymore. You're far too traumatized. I cannot step into a structural organisation. But thank you for the offer.
Well, you're welcome.
Are there any more questions that anyone would want to do what Akua has been saying around the employment or getting into institutions?
I guess, the only thing I would offer, if we're talking about working at sort of across intersectional oppressions, is just ways what we can put in place to support each other. So I had a commission a few years ago, and it was really traumatic. It was quite vile. Fortunately, because I've been knocking around a while, I managed to get two artists who I knew, one of whom also moonlighted as a employment tribunal judge, and the other makes amazing. They're both great art. They're both great artists, but we're multi-skilled. And they support. And one of the things that came out of it is that we need to have some sort of register that as soon as we get an opportunity within these mainstream organizations, we register the fact we've got it. So we sort of put our team on high alert that we may well need some fun. We may well need some care. We may need to be reminded to eat. We may be needed to work out how to renegotiate our contract and make it safe. Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of so I think there are things we can do for ourselves in terms of getting organized just to take care of each other while change happens. Because I think otherwise we as the people who are needing to create change often are the most get expended and used up and damaged in that process of change. That's one thing I'm thinking of.
Right. What I'm going to do next is actually come back to you, Louise. And one of the questions that we have is around the Tate's history. We've been talking about Colston, and again, Tate has a long history. And I've just wondered, how is the Tate acknowledging its own history?
So a few ways, really. Obviously, this is a moment of reevaluation for everyone. I think one of the things that we are very aware of, and that was highlighted by our new director Helen when she came in 2018, is there's a kind of dislocation between some of the programming that we've been having at TATE Liverpool and the colonial discourse that we are very much a part of, whether that's the doc, whether that's the Tate, and the kind of a westernized canon of art history. So what we'll be doing in November coming up, but also then in a full rehang in 2020, is really re-looking at our collections and how they can tell much more diverse stories, and much more diverse voices in both the kind of artist representation, but also we will be doing a project where we've gone for funding, and we were hoping to have a curator that would work across our potential future audiences and the collection. So we'll also be talking to people to think about what that shape could be, and hopefully we get the funding. If not, we'll do the work anyway, because we have to do the work. But I think also TATE itself has done a lot of research into, of course, the associations with Tate and Lyle, and there is an interesting paper which I can post actually to the chat. So although Tate and Lyle were not slave owners, they were absolutely beneficiaries of that system and of that process and of those goods. So I think you'll see a much more interesting history of art being told within TATE Liverpool over the next few years, and I think how we discuss that with our audiences is going to be really important over the next 18 months to 24 months.
And so conversations like this will help inform that process, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll certainly be doing things differently than has been done before, and it just makes it much more interesting. Everybody wants a much more interesting story about what Tate's collections mean to them. We want to hear people's voices. We want to hear people's voices that affects the subject matter that they're looking at. We want a much more active dialogue with our audiences and the collections that we're showing, because we have to remind people it's your collection. We're just looking after it for you, and if we're not looking after it for you in a way that's relevant to you, then that's our problem, and that's something that we need to fix. And it really is about meeting audiences on their own terms, whether that's through a discussion about gender or race or sexuality. That's really our job, to be helping to platform those stories in a much more interesting way.
Right, Ola, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. TATE have explained what they're going to be doing in terms of going forward. Universities, are they looking at curriculums in the similar sort of way?
Absolutely. I mean, again, taking the lead, we have to say, following our East Coast and our counterparts, there's a whole piece on decolonizing curricula, so the curriculums. So across the board, to be honest, not just the arts curriculums or curricula. So there's a close look at what we're teaching, which is why I'm saying it's actually a pedagogic change as to how we actually teach. So you find even in the sciences, for example, I was about a month ago or what, they were saying in medicine, a lot of the characteristics that they tell young doctors to look at are all based on white skin. Yeah. So there's actually a piece being done by young Black doctors about, what to see if you have sepsis, if you're a Black person. I actually remember challenging people back in Liverpool in those days, because I was a whole warden, and I remember, them saying there's a test. I said, well, if you've got Black skin, you're not going to see that. So even that kind of detail. But on a more serious note, the whole decolonizing the curriculum project is big, and it will have direct impact on teaching. There's also the issue about, again, back to what I was saying about taking the university to the people. So I think Oxford and Cambridge particularly have been pushed. So quite a few schools, mainly in London, so it's this issue about the London effect. They actually work with these schools from year one in secondary right through to them actually applying to Oxford and Cambridge. So there is a significant but slow move in terms of diversifying the students who get into these class-based institutions. I have to say though that at academic level, in terms of hiring, again, shout out again, there are very few of us, particularly female Black professors, in areas outside of the sciences. So as you'd expect, in nursing and some areas, we have a few. So that move towards back to the top end of academe, having I like the word people of color, and I'll use it, in those places where we can make a change. We're still very few, but I think those of us who are there are being much more successful at combining and making sure that we actually encourage the next group of women, black academics and so on to move through the system. Because again, if I was to be very critical, if you look at the institutions, there are lots of black lecturers in new universities, but when you look at the Russell Group, we're very thin on the ground. So it's this thing again about creating networks, which again is, that's the club network, isn't it, in terms of groups, and making sure that we actually support and drive people through the academic system, because we know now that there's a lot of research evidence. Students want to go into courses where they see people like them. Mm-hmm. So in medicine, they've managed to break that barrier. You know, a doctor could be any color, any race, any gender. But in certain areas, it's still that the view is not for the likes of us. So at all levels, I think the university, we are beginning to move. It's slow. Some things are moving faster than others, but certainly the decolonization of the curriculum. And I think this is very much a push from this summer of Black Lives Matter has come to the fore of most institutions I know of at the moment. The rest is sort of a more gradual process, but it is there. And I think, again, post-Brexit, surprise, surprise, Britain will start to look again at the internationalization of students. And that means, for those of us of color, it means remembering the Commonwealth. What that will mean and how that discussion and engagement takes place will be interesting again, because everybody's in a different place than they were in the whatever 1960s.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's hope that that discussion is going to be broadened and that there will be collaboration and communication.
And collaborations, I should have said that as well. So I collaborate particularly with Ghana. There's University of Ghana, but Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology had one of the first architecture schools in Africa, and we have direct links. So the colonial model about, oh, we'll send you some scholarships, send us your students, is different. We're now looking at working together. And again, Zoom and so on are really good platforms to do that.
Right. I understand, Akua, you've got a short clip that you would like to play. Could you just explain what it is you're going to show us?
I spoke about it earlier. It was just because we're coming towards a close. I just wanted to share it. So it is a really short little piece of work that I made, shared on Facebook. I've got a series, Facebook and Instagram, in terms of communicating my work as a platform is I use. My website's rubbish. It's always a work in progress. So this is it, shared on Instagram, and with a plea out to other artists to join me on this campaign is how I described it. And let's hope I can share it with you in a way. Oh, it started halfway through. Hang on a second. Yeah. Were you able to see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Briefly.
It's very small. A part of it was wanting to just say, work doesn't have to be overt or obvious. Like sometimes there's a real call on us to do images in a particular way, to be political and make a protest. And that actually that's not always the case. That's part of the work.
Yeah. We have one question from the audience. And it is, equality and diversity policies have existed for some time, but why does it take events like George Floyd, Anthony Walker, Stephen Lawrence, etc., to get institutions to act to address the obvious disparities in race equality that have existed long before and long after these murders? it can come across like good PR from my life experience and studies of history. My question is, what would the Tate be doing, and should arts institutions in general be doing to address these imbalances that they say they recognise? They have in the next, they say they recognise in the next year or two, without falling into the tokenism, but by way of direct action and levelling the playing field in terms of real opportunity and practice. Did you get that, Louise?
Yes. So I think hopefully some of the things that I mentioned in terms of our events program, the way that we recruit, I hope that you will see some real change in the next 18 months to 2 years. I think, how long did you give us? Year or two. So I hope you will see some change, but also I think it's important to just to come back to the collection in terms of that the research in terms of the relevance to slavery isn't finished, and actually there's work that's ongoing with the Legacies of Slave Owners project, which is with the University of Central London, which will excavate links between slavery owners and works in the collection. So that is still an active thing that TATE are doing. We will also be acquiring more artists of colour, both Black and brown artists from the UK and internationally, because I think and looking at the kind of transnational relationship between those two, I think it's really important to say that collection isn't fixed at TATE, and that we have active collecting policies that will that have been more representative over the years. But I really do hope that you'll see a kind of an active change in the programs that we do and the artists that we are working with, and hopefully our staff diversification will happen. And if it hasn't, then come and see me in the next year or two.
Right. One final question, because we're running out of time. How do you support local Black visual artists of all ages in Liverpool to showcase their work at the TATE?
So I think it's probably clear to say that we haven't done enough in that area. So although there have been opportunities to work and to have work on display, whether that's through TATE Exchange or through our events program, those messages haven't got through to or the institution isn't open enough, and we're not meeting people on their terms. So we're looking at that and seeing what we can do in terms of our messaging and what's available for people. But I hope that through the programs that I've mentioned before, you will see those real changes.
Thank you. Can I first thank, I don't know, Selena, is there anything else that you want to add? Because I've just noticed that you've been very quiet and listening.
No, I've just, I think like conversations like these are always beneficial, and not just for like institutions and white folk, but for like other Black artists as well. Again, to feel like you're not like you're on your own or in the sea of other people, keep doing what you're doing is what I want to say. Yeah.
Anybody else want to make some final comments?
Well, I think it's been a wide-ranging discussion. I've really enjoyed it, actually. I wasn't quite sure what I was letting myself in for. I think we've all been pushed, which is good. And we've all been forced to reflect, which is even more important. And I think we need to do more of this. So, Susie, we want more of this.
Right. This is one of the things that we do at BlackFest, so I'm sure there will be plenty more of this. And Akua?
Yeah, I mean the same. I absolutely value the opportunity to meet other artists, and it's always interesting to do that in the context of an art institution. And that from to thank BlackFest for hosting this, but also to say we can continue, and I'm sure you will, through the year. This is something, especially now we've got Zoom and people, audiences are used to it and getting involved in Facebook Live and everything. Please keep doing these sorts of activities, because I would really benefit. I want to keep a relationship with Selena and all that already. It's like, I'm gonna haunt you. And you as well, obviously, Susie. I think, are we all three of us based in Manchester?
I'm not.
But where are you based, Selena?
Yeah, Manchester.
And you're obviously at the Manchester School of Architecture. It's weird.
But I have a secret life. I actually live in Edinburgh.
Really?
Oh, let's have that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, can I just thank all our viewers for tuning in to us. Don't forget to give us likes on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channels. Without you, we don't have an audience and our voices don't go out. I'd also like to quickly just let you know what's happening later on tonight. We have the amazing Adam Lowe hosting a discussion between Trina Arushi and Patrick Graham and others. And tomorrow we have our poetry night. We are also hosting a music night on Saturday, and we'll be closing with the diversity dialogues, which we generally finish on at the end of the festival. All the information is on our website, www.blackfest.co.uk. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion and look forward to seeing you again. And thank you again, Louise, Ikua, Ola, and Selena. Thank you very much.